Okay, well, I appreciate everybody coming to this webinar today. We've got a very interesting speaker, Dave Wetzel from the UK. Title of the talk is, Did Karl Marx Understand the Land Question? So just to give you a little brief introduction, Dave is very experienced and has a wide experience. And I guess what I'm going to do is just say that it's very unusual to have somebody who claims to be a socialist, Marxist, and Georgist in the same breath. So that'll be something I'll be here listening for. Trade unionists probably would define a lot of his experience. One of the things that I was most interested in was the leader of the Hounslow Council, because it sounds like you were like a little mayor or something. So I think what I'm going to do is just sit back and let Dave talk. I do have a series of questions from the works of David Harvey, for example, a well-known Marxist, and other texts. So I'm fully prepared to quiz Dave. So why don't you take it over, Dave?
Okay, thank you very much, Marty, and good to see you again after all these years when you chaired a meeting that both Heather and I spoke at in New York at the consulate of one of the Latin American embassies. I'm going to be using slightly different slides, so if you can move on as I speak, please, Sue, is that possible? Yeah, so as I'm moving forward on my screen, it's not quite the same as yours because I did some revisions, but I'll just carry on. First of all, you've got a picture there of Karl Marx. It's the traditional picture we normally see, but I want to make it clear the context that I view Marx. Many people just view Marx as what has happened in communist countries, and that's not how I view Marx. So my first screen is Marx not to be confused with communist states. And it's easy to dismiss the writings of Marx because of the actions of communist dictators. Obviously, these dictators, while paying lip service to Marx, distorted his teachings for their own ends and for their national ambitions. Stalin was more like Catherine the Great or Putin than like Karl Marx. Even these dictators didn't agree amongst themselves, and certainly before the Russian Revolution, Lenin was predicting that England and Germany would be the countries to go communist first because they had an educated working class. And he didn't see any chance of Russia being the first communist country because it was still a feudal agricultural economy. And he felt that without industrial working class, they couldn't go communist. And then again, back in the 1930s, Stalin himself said China, for the same reason, couldn't become communist under Mao Zedong because it was a peasant society and they also needed to have a working class working in factories before they could go into communism. So who do you think wrote this? Private property in land implies the privilege of a landlord to exploit the body of the globe, the bowels of the earth, the air, and with them the conservation and development of life. And I read this statement sort of regarding economic justice, pollution, and climate change. For somebody to be writing that in the 19th century, I find quite mind-blowing, really. But of course, it was written by Karl Marx, and most people would not realize that Karl Marx was also a young man. We're used to the pictures of him with his beard and an old man, but looking at this picture, he seems quite a good-looking young man. I then do a bit of a comparison between Karl Marx. Now, I've written Karl Marx in blue because wherever I'm going to be quoting Karl Marx, I'm going to have it in blue, the quotes, and where rarely in this presentation, because it's about Marx, not George, but where I include George and any of his quotes, they're going to be in italics, but in the colour green. So Marx was born in Prussia in 1818. 21 years later, in 1839, Henry George was born in Philadelphia. Marx died in London in 1883. He was aged 65. And George died 14 years later, 1897. And he was 58 years when he died in New York. And here comes a similarity. Karl Marx was a journalist, an economist, and a philosopher. And I think most of us would agree that Henry George was a journalist, economist, and a philosopher. Both Karl Marx and Henry lived most of their lives trying to change society for the better. They both experienced dire poverty. And from my point of view, unfortunately, they never met, which is something George mentions in his letter for the memorial of Karl Marx. But let's try and understand just a little bit of Marx. I don't intend to give, in this presentation, complete concept of his ideas. It would be impossible anyway in one presentation. We're going to be concentrating on Marx and land, but and particularly Marx and rent. But in his lifetime, Marx dwelt on the dichotomy between the working class and the capitalist class. But he spends little space investigating the clash between landowners and capitalists, or landowners and workers. Marx also talks of the inevitability where tribalism, perhaps like in Scotland or Anglo-Saxon system in England, was replaced by feudalism. And then, of course, feudalism itself has been replaced by mercantilism and then capitalism. Marx predicted that this system of change will inevitably lead to socialism and then to what I call pure communism. He envisaged a system where exchange took place without money. His actual words were, from each according to their abilities and to each according to their needs. According to Marx, this process of change is not predetermined by rulers, leaders, or philosophers, but by what Marx described as dialectic materialism, whereby economic forces and the different classes clash. Marx predicts that by its selfish treatment of the working class, the capitalist class is sowing the seeds of its own destruction. And then Henry George. I assume most people in this audience already know much more about Henry George than I do. His classic work was Progress and Poverty, written in 1879, which he typeset by his own hand because of the difficulty he had finding a publisher. The subtitle is equally descriptive as the main title, an inquiry into the cause of industrial depressions and of increase of want with increase of wealth, the remedy. Is Henry George a socialist? Today, few Marxists have even heard of Henry George, but of those who have, most would say, no, Henry George is not a socialist. And I guess most Georgists would also say the same thing. No, Henry George is not a socialist. However, I have my own doubts. In Progress and Poverty, George says this, and it may be said generally that businesses, which are in their nature monopolies, are properly part of the functions of the state and should be assumed by the state. That is why government should carry telegraphic messages as it should carry letters, that railroads should belong to the public as well as common roads. but all other monopolies are trivial in extent as compared with the monopoly of land. There are many socialists here in the UK who argue that rail nationalisation or Royal Mail post-nationalisation would be too left-wing for the Labour Party. So that's interesting because in the modern perspective, it places Henry George to the left of many socialists in the British Labour Party. Continuing with this idea, is George a socialist? He wrote, "The natural progress of social development is unmistakably towards cooperation, or, if the word be preferred, towards socialism. Though I dislike to use a word to which such various and vague meanings are attached." He also says, civilization is the art of living together in closer relations. He says that mankind should dwell together in unity is the evidence of the immutable laws of the physical and moral universe which reward obedience and punish disobedience. Social Problems, 1883. In his letter read at Karl Marx's funeral, George wrote, "In the teachings of Karl Marx, there were the recognition of two profound truths, for which his memory deserves to be held in special honour. He taught the solidarity of labour, the brotherhood of man. He saw and taught that the road to social regeneration lies not through destruction and anarchy, but through the promulgation of ideas and the education of the people. And his memory will be cherished as one who saw and struggled for that reign of justice in which armies shall be disbanded and poverty shall be unknown and government shall become cooperation. That golden age of peace and plenty, the possibility of which is beginning even now to be recognised among the masses all over the civilised world." My words now: nationalisation, cooperation, replacing capitalism, solidarity, mankind dwelling together in unity, brotherhood, education, peace and plenty. Surely these are all socialist ideals. But it's interesting how Marx and George never met. They didn't even directly correspond with each other. But they did make some disparaging remarks about each other to other people. Marx is quoted to have said that George is a writer of talent, and I think we all endorse that. The man is, in theory, completely behind the times. He understands nothing of surplus value. Capitalism's last ditch was another description he gave. And regarding George's remedy, he called it a sticking plaster to capitalism. He could see that capitalism was going to collapse sometime in the future, and he thought that George's idea of a land value tax would merely delay that collapse. It wouldn't stop it. But similarly, George also wrote in a particular letter, Marx lacked analytical power and lacked logical habits of thought. He also said Marx is a superficial thinker, and he characterised Marx as the prince of muddle heads. But as he says himself in the letter for the memorial of Marx, that he hadn't had the benefit of reading Marx's works because at that time they hadn't been published in English. Some of life's influences. Karl Marx was born into a Jewish family where on his mother's side they started the Dutch Philips Electronics Company. His father changed his Jewish name to a German name and converted to Christianity. Marx was an atheist. He wrote, "Religion is the opium of the people." Henry George was born to a Christian Episcopalian family, but he himself believed in theistic humanitarianism. Karl Marx lived in Prussia, Paris and Belgium, and because the authorities were trying to suppress him and his ideas, he was eventually forced to live most of his adult life in London as a refugee. As a teenager, aged 15, George sailed to Melbourne and Calcutta as a crew member on the ship called the Hindu. But he lived all his life in the United States, namely Philadelphia, San Francisco and New York. And after 1880, he travelled to Europe and Australia lecturing. Whilst visiting Glasgow, George read the inscription on the Scottish Stock Exchange, and that read, "The earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof." And George stated the apostrophe is in the wrong place. What he meant was it should be Lord's with an apostrophe after the Lord's, meaning the earth or the fullness of the earth doesn't belong to one Lord, i.e. a deity, but it belongs to all the landlords. Marx lived in Europe with the reasonably recent land enclosures and the early obscenities of the Industrial Revolution, exploiting men, women, and even children. George witnessed the opening up of the West with land cheaply or relatively freely available for the adventurous. And now we come to George's letter at the time of Marx's death. It was read out to a very large memorial meeting of communists, socialists, workers, and single taxers held in New York to honour the life of Karl Marx. George wrote, "I desire to express my deep respect for a man whose life was devoted to efforts for the improvement of social conditions. I never had the good fortune to meet Karl Marx, nor have I been able to read his works, which are untranslated into English. I am consequently incompetent to speak with precision of his views. As I understand them, there are several important points on which I differ from them. But no difference of opinion can lessen the esteem which I feel for the man who so steadfastly, so patiently, and so self-sacrificingly laboured for the freedom of the oppressed and the elevation of the downtrodden. In the life and in the teachings of Karl Marx, there were the recognition of two profound truths, for which his memory deserves to be held in special honour. He was the founder of the International, the first attempt to unite in a holy alliance of the people, the working men of all countries. He taught the solidarity of labour, the brotherhood of man, and wherever his influence has reached, it has tended to destroy those prejudices of nation and race which have been in all ages the most efficient means by which tyranny has been established and maintained. For this I honour Karl Marx. And I honour Karl Marx because he saw and taught that the road to social regeneration lies not through destruction and anarchy, but through the promulgation of ideas and the education of the people. He realised that the enslavement of the masses is everywhere due to their ignorance. And realising this, he set himself to work to master and to point out the social economic laws without the recognition of which all effort for social improvement is but a blind and fruitless struggle. Karl Marx has gone, but the work he has done remains. Whatever may have been in it, of that error inseparable from all human endeavour, will in turn be eliminated. But the good will perpetuate itself, and his memory will be cherished as one who sought and struggled for that reign of justice in which armies shall be disbanded, and poverty shall be unknown, and government shall become cooperation. That golden age of peace and plenty, the possibility of which is beginning even now to be recognised among the masses all over the civilised world. I join with you in paying to such a man the tribute of brotherly regard. So, what did Marx actually say about land? in the Economic and Philosophic manuscripts of 1844, on the chapter on rent, Marx said, "Let us now see how the landlord exploits everything from which society benefits." He then immediately quoted Adam Smith from The Wealth of Nations, who included the rent of land increases with population. And then back to Marx, he says, "We've already learned how the rent of land increases with railways, etc., with the improvement, safety and multiplication of the means of communication." He was referring to Das Kapital, chapter volume 2, and he quotes that. Every important improvement in the circumstances of society tends either directly or indirectly to raise the real rent of land, to increase the real wealth of the landlord, his power of purchasing the labour or the produce of the labour of other people. All those improvements in the productive powers of labour, which tend directly to reduce the real price of manufactures, tend indirectly to raise the real rent of land. I don't think Henry George would have disagreed with any of those comments. In 1848, Marx advocates the collection of rent in the Communist Manifesto. It was written by himself and Engels, and they presented a list of 10 measures to reform society, not to make it a socialist society, but to move it towards becoming a socialist society. And don't forget, he then saw the socialist society transforming into a pure communist society at some later stage. Now, as for me, I don't agree with all of the 10 measures, and I don't think you would either. One of them is having an income tax, for example. But interesting, the very first in the list. Now, I don't know whether it's just by chance or whether it's in order of importance, but the very first item in the list reads, abolition of property in land and application of all rents of land to public purposes. Now, Marx was only 25 when he first started writing about rent. Similarly, Henry George was 31 when he met the teamster overlooking San Francisco Bay, who told him that the railroad would raise land to $1,000 per acre. And it was as a result of that meeting that George cottoned on to the whole question of land and land rent. In 1872, Marx wrote a paper, The Nationalization of Land. He says, the property in the soil is the original source of all wealth and has become the great problem upon the solution of which depends the future of the working class. I do not intend discussing here all the arguments put forward by the advocates of private property in land, by jurists, philosophers, and political economists, but shall confine myself firstly to state that they have tried hard to disguise the primitive fact of conquest under the cloak of natural right. If conquest constituted a natural right on the part of the few, the many have only to gather sufficient strength in order to acquire the natural right of reconquering what has been taken from them. In the progress of history, the conquerors found it convenient to give to their original titles, derived from brute force, a sort of social standing through the instrumentality of laws imposed by themselves. And one of the stories I tell about Robinson Crusoe makes that very point. So if we have time in discussion, I'll be happy to share that with you. At last comes the philosopher. This is back to Marx. At last comes the philosopher and demonstrates that those laws employ and express universal consent of mankind. If private property in land be indeed founded upon such a universal consent, it will evidently become extinct from the moment the majority of a society dissent from warranting it. Now, Marx's greatest work was the book Capital, and in German he published it as Das Kapital, and I intend to continue calling it Das Kapital. The proper title in English is just Capital, but in this presentation I don't want the book to be confused with one of the three factors of production. So we'll continue calling it Das Kapital. Volume 1, 1867 in German, but not published in English until 1886, after Marx's death, concentrates on the labour theory of value, showing how workers are exploited by capitalists in as much as workers never receive in pay the full value of their labour. The amount by which a worker is exploited, Marx describes as surplus value. The calculations are based on average labour time or socially necessary labour time. Marx explains how the dissolution of the monasteries in England and the English enclosures all divorced people from the land, which created the workforce for the factories and the mills. He says, in the history of primitive accumulation, all revolutions are epoch-making that act as levers for the capital class in course of formation. But above all, those moments when great masses of men are suddenly and forcibly torn from their means of substance and hurled as free and unattached proletarians on the labour market. The expropriation of the agricultural producer of the peasant from the soil is the basis of the whole process. It's interesting that he pins the whole process of capital exploitation as being based on workers being divorced from land in order to support themselves. In volume 2 of Das Kapital, it was first of all produced by Engels from Marx's drafts. He had complete drafts which Engels was able to put together, and he published it in German in 1885. And volume 2 provides further discussion re the functions of productive capital, its circulation and commodities. He also distinguishes between fixed and circulating costs. Marx rediscovers rent, or as Georgist might say, Marx sees the cat. This is in volume 3, Das Kapital, part 6. So there's 5 other parts before he gets to the theory of rent. Again, this was published in 1894, but not published in English until the next century in 1909. The book is much more interesting than the previous 2 volumes. When he died, Marx left copious notes that he had written over many years. But those notes weren't in chapter form, or certainly not in book form. So Engels had to compile these notes together, make them into chapters, and then he published them as volume 3 of Das Kapital, 11 years after Marx's death. This means that apart from his 1844 paper and the 1848 quote in the manifesto, no early Marxists had the benefit of Marx's thinking on rent until 1894, and English speakers not until 1909. Even today, most people who describe themselves as Marxists that I've met only read the Communist Manifesto, and perhaps if you're lucky, they have read volume 1 of Das Kapital. In this volume, volume 3 of Das Kapital, Marx also contradicts some of his theories in volume 1. Many Marxists who disagree with the annual land value tax or collecting the rent of land when it's nationalised say that volume 3 is not an accurate depiction of Marx's own thoughts, because Engels injected his own thinking and he inaccurately transcribed the notes. Well, Continuing in that part 6, Marx talks about the transformation of surplus profit into ground rent. And he goes on to explain differential rent. And he also introduces the idea of an absolute rent. Differential rent has, this is Marx, differential rent has the peculiarity that landed property here merely intercepts the surplus profit, which would otherwise flow into the pocket of the farmer. And my words are, his introduction, Engels describes volume 3. It's very interesting reading Engels' own introduction to volume 3. He says the most important parts of the entire work is the most important part of Das Kapital. I can only agree with his analysis. Referring to Marx's notes, Engels writes, there exists only the beginning of the final chapter. So this is right at the end of volume 3. There's the final chapter to be done, and it's only the beginning which Marx has got to before he gives up writing and dies. There exists only the beginning of the final chapter. It was to treat the 3 major classes of developed capitalist society: the landowners, capitalists, and wage labourers, corresponding to the 3 great forms of revenue: ground rent, profit, and wages. Well, these are very similar, not just similar, they're exactly the same as the thoughts of Henry George back in 1879 when he published Progress and Poverty. And I believe this analysis is a description, not just familiar to Georgists, but one we can all recognise. And if only Marx had lived a few more years to develop these ideas further, the history of the 19th century and the history of the 20th century and the history of the world might have been totally different and totally happier. But Marx did discuss absolute ground rent. In volume 3, Marx explains rent much more fully than in any of his other writings. I don't suggest he got everything right. He obviously didn't understand the concept of free land at the margin of production. That is, the least productive land which can produce, but only economically if there's no rent to pay and no taxes incurred. This is not surprising to me, as by 1867, when volume 1 was published, all land in Europe, and especially in England where he worked, had been claimed by landowners. And even for centuries before, land at or below the margin had a price, even when it was standing idle for decades, because no landowner would part with it unless they were adequately recompensed. Consequently, Marx introduces the idea of 2 rents: differential rent and absolute rent. And just for the benefit of any Marxist scholars, I ought to make it clear that I do know that he divided it into 4 rents, but I think that's far too specific for this presentation. From volume 3, Das Kapital, Marx writes, the following question now rises. Does it follow from the fact that the worse soil yields ground rent, which cannot be derived from any difference in fertility, that the price of land is necessarily a monopoly price in the usual sense, or a price into which the rent enters, like a tax, with the sole distinction that the landlord levies the tax instead of the state? Landed property is here the barrier which does not permit any new investment of capital in hitherto uncultivated or unrented land without levying a tax. In other words, without demanding a rent. Wow. When I first read this, I thought, yeah, go for it, Marx. If you can relate rent to a landowner as a tax imposed by the landowner, take the next mental leap forward to follow George and advocate an annual land value tax. Marx is not only concerned with agricultural land. Some critics of Marx imply that he only treated the land question as an agricultural matter. And indeed, when I mention land to socialists today, and I often do, many of them can only think of beautiful fields, rolling hills and forests. Few consider the land under their feet, under their homes, under their shopping malls, under their workplaces. But although, like Ricardo, Marx used agriculture in his examples, he was quite clear that he was referring to urban as well as rural land. As he says in volume 3, rent is distinguished in the first place by the preponderant influence exerted here by location upon differential rent. Very significant, for example, in vineyards and building sites in large cities. And also from volume 3, the mere legal ownership of land does not create any ground rent for the owner, but it does indeed give him the power to withdraw his land from exploitation until economic conditions permit him to utilize it in such a manner as to yield him a surplus, be it used for actual agriculture or other production purposes, such as buildings, etc. He cannot increase or decrease the absolute magnitude of this sphere, but he can change the quantity of land placed on the market. Hence, it is characteristic fact that in all civilized countries, a comparatively appreciable portion of the land always remains uncultivated. And then, considering Marx and house speculation, he says, it is the ground rent and not the house which forms the actual object of building speculation in rapidly growing cities, especially where construction is carried on as an industry. For example, in London, as has already been illustrated in Book 2, in the testimony of a big building speculator in London, Edward Capps, given before the House of Commons Select Committee on Bank Acts of 1857, he stated, now this is what Edward Capps said to Parliament in 1857. I think a man who wishes to rise in the world can hardly expect to rise by following out a fair trade. It is necessary for him to add speculative building to it, and that must be done not on a small scale, for the builder makes very little profit out of the buildings themselves. He makes the principal part of the profit out of the improved ground rents. And he goes on to give a financial example. But finishes saying, rather than from the profit of the buildings, the man who wants to go on in the world scarcely looks at the buildings. In many instances, he says he scarcely looks at the buildings at all. And Marx has quoted that in his book. And he goes on to say himself, and it should not be forgotten that after the lapse of the lease, generally at the end of 99 years, the land with all its buildings and its ground rent, usually increased in the interim 2 or 3 times, reverts from the building speculator or his legal successor to the original last landlord. And again, he says, landed property acts as an absolute barrier only to the extent that the landlord exacts a tribute for making land at all accessible to the investment of capital. For as soon as the land has been rented, landed property ceases to act as an absolute barrier against the investment of necessary capital. But still it continues to act as a relative barrier, even after that, insofar as the reversion to the landlord of the capital, incorporated in the land, circumscribes the activity of the tenant within the very definite limits. What he means is that if you're renting land for, say, whatever period of lease, and you know you've got to give back your capital infrastructure you put on the land, or improving the infrastructure that's already there, back to the owner of the land after the lease has expired, then you're obviously not encouraged to make too many improvements, because you're not going to get the long-term benefit. They'll go to the landowner. And we've already heard one quote from Adam Smith, and it's quite interesting. Marx does quote quite a bit from Adam Smith. Marx himself says, landlord's right has its origin in robbery. The landlords, like all other men, love to reap where they never sowed and demand a rent even for the natural produce of the earth. And in that, he's quoting Adam Smith. And Smith and Marx mentions that one of Smith's merits is already demonstrated there are quite different determination of prices to be observed in cattle raising. That is a detail. I don't think we need to go into that, but anyone reading the slides can read it. But at the end of it, it says, the rent of land, therefore, considered as the price paid for the use of the land, is naturally a monopoly price. It is not all proportion to what the landlord may have laid out upon the improvement of the land, or to what he can afford to take, but to what the farmer can afford to give. And that's Adam Smith. And we all know that if credit is more freely advanced, that reflects back into land prices. I want to talk a little bit about a visit I had to the Soviet Union many years ago. And I titled it, The Soviet Union Had Adopted Marx's Proposal. I could equally have titled it, If the Soviet Union Had Adopted Henry Georgist's Proposal. That is, to use the rent of land to fund public services. In 1983, with my family, I visited the Soviet Union as the head of a trade union delegation. We travelled to many cities. In Minsk, we visited a big rambling tractor factory that spread out from almost the centre of the town to the outskirts, like a huge wedge of cheese. Our hotel was at the very edge of town, adjacent to a forest. When visiting the factory, I asked the chief executive officer how much rent he paid for the land he occupied. His reply was that I needed to understand that in the Soviet Union, land is free, and he paid nothing for the land. Well, I'm in favour of business parks and trees between buildings, but obviously not in the most valuable part of town, not in the central business district. Imagine how many tourist hotels his factory was excluding from the business centre, and how many other cooperatives and small businesses were denied access to the best locations in Minsk. If the government had collected the economic rent of his factory would have vacated the town centre, and they would have consolidated on the outskirts. And no doubt they would have chosen to be on a suburban area close to good roads, or a suburban area close to good rail connections. But they would have then allowed other businesses that actually need access to the town centre to pay more rent and to flourish by occupying the town centre, the business district. And had they done that across the whole of the Soviet Union, I think the history of the Soviet Union, and indeed the history of the world, would have been totally different. So my summary today is this. Marx did not get everything right, but I believe he was looking in the right direction. He was on a 39-year journey that took him from the rent of land, the Communist Manifesto, land nationalisation, Volume 1, Das Kapital, Volume 2, Das Kapital, and into the lightness of Volume 3, Das Kapital. And then he died in 1883. Socialists had no opportunity to see Volume 3 until 1884, English speakers until 1909. So except for Henry George, David Ricardo, Thomas Paine, and writers advocating land nationalisation, the early Marxists had no opportunity to understand differential rent. Interestingly, of the 29 Socialist Labour MPs elected in 1906, Labour's first general election, over 90% quoted Progress and Poverty as, apart from the Bible, the book that most influenced their political thinking. Today, I don't suppose even 1% of the 200 sitting Labour MPs would cite Henry George. Most of them won't have even heard of it. I just wish that both Karl Marx and Henry George had lived longer in order to exchange their ideas. I think had that done so, I think a bit of socialism would have permeated into the Georgist thinking, and I think a lot of Georgist ideas would have permeated into the socialist thinking. So that's been a great loss to mankind. So finally, I asked the question at the beginning, did Karl Marx understand the land question? Well, I hope I've helped you yourself, to answer this question.
That was an excellent presentation, Dave. I think what we'll do at this point is let me point out a few things about my impression of your presentation and some of the questions you asked. Then we'll turn it over for some Q&A. My first observation is that clearly George was correct in the understanding the progression of society, and that Karl Marx kind of owes a debt to Henry George in large measure. One of the things I did want to suggest is, from this point on, is that it would be a very interesting exercise to imagine Karl Marx living longer than Henry George and imagining what his eulogy for Henry George would have said. I think that might be a really good exercise, because I think it would explore that to depth to some of the socialist thought from Henry George. But I think what I see is a confusion of what a capitalist is, and I know that Marx mentioned rentiers, but it's very clear that he's lumping a lot of rent seekers in that category of capitalists. So if you're going to throw a rotten tomato, you're throwing it at more people than you really should be throwing. But in my conclusion that it was Henry George who got the ideas correct, and not necessarily everything that Karl Marx taught. I would like to quote from the book by David Harvey, who's a very well-known Marxist, kind of demonstrating that in fact it was Henry George that got it right. So one of the things that he says is that money can be made out of essentially land rent, is too often ignored, as it is a fundamental aspect of the reproduction of capitalism. And then he says that rent has to be brought forward into the forefront of the analysis rather than being treated as a derivative category of distribution, as happens in Marxist as well as in conventional economic theory. So this is something that was written in 2010 by a very well-known Marxist, demonstrating to me that Henry George had it right. So those are some of the initial observations I wanted to make, but maybe one last one before the Q&A was that it seemed like this concept of a necessary conflict was an essential element of Marx, and I think there's some confusion over, you know, what is the opponent of the working classes, whether it's the state or whether it was people who had political and military power. It just, to me, it seems as though that Marx didn't have a good appreciation for the forces that are really in opposition to labor, that Henry George had a better concept because he knew what the source of their power was, and it was in the monopoly and monopoly rent. So that's just my opening observations. I'd like to hear what other people had to say, or maybe have you respond to what I just said.
Don't know if you meant to say, but you said Marx owes a debt to Henry George. When you opened up, you're talking about progression of society. I certainly don't think Marx would have recognised that he owed a debt to Henry George, because I don't think he took George too seriously, which is a shame. I wish he had. And on the broad thing of what you've just said, I'm not saying Marx is better than George. That was not the purpose of this presentation. It's just that over the years, and I shall be 80 this year, and I've been, well, I tell the story that when I was 14, I wanted a new bike for my birthday, and my dad gave me a copy of Progress and Poverty. So you can imagine the disappointment of a 14-year-old, but it was the best possible present any father could have given his son. And I've been advocating at school elections, and ever since, all my life, the ideas of Henry George. So I'm not saying that Marx is better than George. I'm not saying that we should drop George in favour of Marx, far from it. But what I am saying, many of the people I've met, particularly within Georgist circles, have been completely denigrate Marx, and I'm just trying to bring him back out of the grave.
Yeah. Well, before we get into Q&A, I want people to see the shirt that I'm wearing. It says, we have a picture of Henry George, and it says, "Makes socialism superfluous," which kind of lets people know that I'm a left Georgist, which I think is a new category to a lot of people. But I'm warm to your side of what George is. So I'm done moderating at this point. I would like to hear what people have to say.
We have one question from Q&A from Walter Horn, who said, "You've distinguished Marxist positions from those of ostensible Marxists like Putin and Mao. I'm wondering whether you put earlier spokespeople, particularly Lenin, on the Marx side or the Putin side of the ledger."
I think Lenin is on the, well, I don't think Putin is a Marxist. So, you know, first thing, he's certainly a capitalist. He owns a lot of capital himself. I don't think he's a Marxist in any sense of the word, and his state today is not a Marxist state in any sense of the word. It's not a socialist state in any sense of the word. But if I was, well, as I am being pushed to shove to put Lenin one side or the other, I would put Lenin in quite clearly in with Stalin. And I did include Lenin in the written statement. I didn't, in the PowerPoint, I didn't use the word Lenin in my speech.
Okay, next question is from Gavin Kerr. And he said, Dave, businesses which are in their natural monopolies, are you saying that George thought that businesses generally tend to be in their nature monopolies, or that he thought that some businesses are in their nature monopolies?
Oh, definitely the latter. He wasn't suggesting that all businesses will become monopolies, but of course we've seen lots of businesses become oligopolies, if not monopolies, because business people don't like competition. Why are all these internet companies buying out smaller internet companies for millions and millions of dollars? They're doing it because they see somebody with a bright idea could make their big business obsolete. So rather than face the competition and let the first best product win, they buy the product, and in some cases they suppress it and destroy it, and in others they incorporate it into their own business. So it's a bit of both, really. But I think from George's perspective, writing at his time, he saw, my interpretation is that he saw natural monopolies, and like the railways and the telegraph, these were natural monopolies. You wouldn't have two competing railways with tracks side by side offering different fares, different levels of service between the same two towns. And so he could see that as being a monopoly. And quite rightly, I think he says that it should be in the hands of the state.
His examples were all right.
I'm very much in favour. Sorry.
His examples were all right-of-way monopolies, patent monopolies, and coercive monopolies like a private military. Those are to me, those are his three categories of natural monopolies. They're right-of-way, patents, and which is a licensed monopoly, and coercive monopolies.
I don't disagree with that. Okay. I think that's what George was saying.
Okay. Wayne Looney has a question for you. To the extent that there was anything valid in Marx's idea of surplus value, isn't it really rent?
No. Employers can pay their rent for a piece of land either as a lump sum by buying the land or paying a lease. And once they've done that, any cash surplus their business makes goes into their bank account. So if they can suppress the wages, then they'll make more money. And I've seen that in London. I used to be chairman of London buses, all the 8,000 buses we used to operate in London when I was working for the mayor. We had, prior to us, a Tory government had privatised the bus business. And they did it in London by allowing private firms to win contracts to operate bus services in London. So they were sort of like paying, if you like, or charging less money because the buses ran at a loss. But they were claiming less subsidy from the government to run a bus service than London Transport would need. But what was the difference? How could they run a bus service and make a profit? The cost of the fuel was the same as London Transport. The cost of buying buses was the same as London Transport. What they could do was reduce the quality of the service, not have so many inspectors, for example. They could pay the drivers less. They could change the pension system for the drivers, which is deferred wages. That didn't go into their land value, that went to their shareholders. And that is the struggle that Marx is talking about between employer and employee, between capitalist and worker. And I agree that the rent of land should go to the state. And if it did, it would put a lot of businesses in fair competition with each other. For example, back in 1994, Heather and I bought a small little shop in Cornwall in the southwest of England. And we ran that shop as a, well, I would call it an antique shop, but if you guys ever came in and saw it, you'd tell me it was a junk shop. But we operated that shop, and we didn't have to pay any rent because we paid freehold for the building. Now, somebody next door renting from a landowner had to pay the rent to the landowner before they started making a profit. But our accountant told us the total difference between our total income and our total expenditure was profit. But of course, you and I know that wasn't all profit. A lot of it was rent that we could defer because we owned the building. We didn't have to literally pay. So it meant that we could actually trim our prices against the competition. It leads to unfair competition. So I think Henry George and Karl Marx were both right. Let's collect the rent of land and use it to pay for public services. And that's without going into the whole question of how taxes push the economy down. And if we collect the rent of land, we wouldn't need to charge all these bad taxes.
Sean Hayes has a comment, just a comment. It is clear that the words capitalism, communism, and socialism place a preconceived set of ideas in our heads that limit our that limit our abilities to expand our thinking and find new solutions. New solutions are found by in the hidden spaces in between them and things. So that was just a comment from Sean. A question now from Ed Dotson. To what extent do you think the followers of Marx felt threatened by the fact that the movement started by George was expanding during the 1880s up to the early 20th century?
I think Ed is probably better qualified to talk on the history of the Georgist movement at that time than I am. My perception would be that the Georgist movement was strong and powerful. I would have wanted it to work in harmony with the socialist movement and the Marxist movement. I've spent a good part of my adult life now trying to get socialists, communists, dare I say, Marxists who are not communists perhaps, and others to accept the ideas of Henry George and accept the idea that land is fundamental. Certainly today, they don't see Henry George, Georgists or the Georgist movement as any sort of threat. But I do think they should pick up the pearl, polish it off, and use the gems that Henry George has offered the whole world, including to the socialist movement.
Yeah. Actually, I wanted to put in a little note that I think the biggest mistake that Henry George made in his life was to distance himself from socialists in 1887 up in Albany during that conference. Because what he could have done is just keep people guessing whether he was a socialist or not. He didn't, what he needed was the union movement behind him. And there was no need to do what he did, my personal opinion.
Well, of course, in this country, the union movement, trade union movement, is not specifically socialist. The Labour Party was formed in 1900 by the trade union movement. And until 1918, the only way you could join was through being a trade unionist. There was no individual membership until 1918. And the Labour Party itself was not expressively in its policies and its constitution a socialist party until 1918, when it adopted socialism. And so for George to win the support of the union movement, I don't know what it was like in America, but certainly in this country, most of the trade unions in this country were liberals. And the only reason they turned from the Liberal Party and formed their own Labour Party was because, in their wisdom or otherwise, the leaders of the Liberal Party were not promoting benefits for the working class. And so the trade unions, if they exist for anything at all, it is to promote the interests of the working class. And when they saw no political party was offering them that, then they went and formed the Labour Party. And one of the biggest things that supported the Labour Party was the Tough Vale judgment, where railway workers in Tough Vale went on strike, and the law lords insisted that they reimburse the owners of the railway the cost that they'd incurred because of the strike, the money they'd lost through the strike. It bankrupted the trade union, and that was a huge recruiting sergeant for the trade union movement, and for the trade union movement to realise the state is opposed to them, and therefore they moved them towards socialism.
Next question is from Robbie Denny. A Marxist friend responded to the following title of this presentation: Did George understand the labor question? Thoughts? What are your thoughts on this?
I suppose I've got to say yes. And what I've tried to impart today is that he only partially understood the land question. If I was answering my own question, I would say partially.
Okay.
But yeah, I think he understood the labour question. He was ahead of most people of his time, recognising that trade unions would grow, that the working man and the working class would win the vote. Don't forget, not every adult in my country had to vote till 1927. And he recognised that that was happening. There were two quotes I didn't include in the commentary. One was "Workers of the world unite." I wish that Henry George had had a similar, not the same, but a similar quote that would galvanise people into action. Another one, he said, philosophers need to change the world, not to interpret the world. And he was active politician at the same time as he was doing all his research and all his writings. He was galvanizing socialists across Europe to adopt socialist thinking and socialist ideas, and for the trade unions to adopt. And I suppose the final quote I didn't include, which I might have done. Karl Marx said, "I am not a Marxist."
Okay, I have two things from Gavin here that I'm going to combine. Might there be an incentive for the smaller companies to come up with their ideas? And he also said, if the natural monopolies are socialized, is that enough to constitute socialism?
No, socialism is far more than just an economic policy from my point of view. But socialism does imply that people, I agree with George, he saw small businesses ending up as cooperatives. And I think there'll be consumer cooperatives, worker cooperatives, much more than we have at the current time. people won't want to exploit each other under socialism. I think socialism will create a different attitude. My belief isn't because of some religious ideal. I'm not religious, I'm an atheist. But I look at what has happened over slavery. In olden times, from the ancients right up to the 19th century, it wasn't just common for people to own slaves. It was accepted. It was respectable to own slaves. You know, as I understand it, you guys will know more than me, but some of the founding fathers owned slaves. And now, if I tried to own another person, own a slave, you would condemn me. And everybody, I hope, would condemn me. Because we've changed the law and because we've changed behaviour by imposing the law, making slavery illegal, we have changed people's behaviour and even their moral thoughts. And I think with socialism, when we make exploitation of each other illegal, or under the Georgist theorem, unnecessary because of the access to land, and I agree. You know, Heather and I, we were in South Africa. We were being served by a waitress in Johannesburg who had come there from Zimbabwe. And she desperately wanted to open her own restaurant. And what was the stumbling? The barrier that Karl Marx was talking about in this presentation. The barrier was the landowner not releasing the land that she required in order to build her own restaurant. And I think that once we all have access to land through the collection of land rent, then many businesses, many companies that have got brilliant ideas that we never see the light of day of will flourish, but it won't flourish through exploitation. It will flourish through goodwill, cooperation and help. And if I dare say, use the word love, because I think brotherly love is far more important than any hatred for people because of race, colour, gender or whatever.
Okay, one question from Lee Hatchadorian. In spite of the idea of taking rent appearing in the Communist Manifesto, you quoted Marx as saying that land value tax would be a plaster or band-aid on capitalism or the last ditch of capitalism. You say that you support the state collecting the rent of businesses, i.e. the factory in Minsk. I'd like to ask you what you think Marx thought of about LVT. Is it useful but inadequate, i.e. revolution and state takeover of non-monopoly businesses is still necessary? Is it merely ineffective, or perhaps worse, is it a distraction that makes it look like the capitalists are doing something, the last ditch, and merely forestalls the necessary revolution?
I don't think I can actually answer that question. I'm trying to look into chat, see if I can read it for myself, because I didn't quite understand it.
Okay, let me see if I can.
But what I would say, from what I did understand, that Marx's position was, I think, he was saying Henry George is offering a reform type of capitalism. Henry George is offering laissez-faire capitalism with one reform whereby we collect the rent. I don't think Marx understood, perceived, or could envisage how once you change that relationship between the three factors of production, labour, capital, and land, that it is quite fundamental. He could half see it because he could see in the development capitalism, they had to get rid of the small holdings in land in order to drive people to go and work in the factories. And he says that that was an element of creation of capitalism. But he didn't understand, I don't think, the real nuances of Henry George's reform. He didn't, and maybe it was impossible. And that's why I would have liked them to have met. That's why I would have liked them both to have lived longer. And I'd like them to have discussed each other's ideas, because I think some of one would have rubbed off onto the other, and it would have made both of them working cooperatively stronger, and their whole ideas and the method of implementation of the ideas stronger than what we have them today as two separate parts. And I suppose a part of my life has been spent, a good part of my life, trying to bring socialism, merge socialism and Henry George, the two ideas together. But I must be honest, I do a lot of lobbying. I've spoken to a lot of Labour MPs, a lot of trade union leaders. But on the other hand, I've spoken to a lot of Liberal MPs and a lot of Tory MPs, some of whom today are in the government. And usually when I start, they know from my political background, I'm a left-wing socialist. And so I start by saying, ignore the fact that I'm a socialist, listen to the words. And what I'm telling you about collecting rent and using it to get rid of income tax, get rid of VAT, get rid of all taxes on employment, get rid of all taxes on trade, except for behavioural taxes that we don't want people to smoke and drink themselves to death. But that idea, that concept, that is good for a Labour politician who wants socialism, but it's also good for a Tory politician who wants capitalism. Capitalism would be much better, much more efficient. The state would work much better if you didn't have all these high levels of taxation on individuals and on businesses, and you put that burden onto the shoulders where it belongs, and that is onto the rentier. The people who get something for nothing, they're the ones that should be paying it. And I say that to Tories and I say it to Labour. I don't feel that the Henry George message is only a message for socialists. I think it's a message for everybody.
Okay, we've got 3 more questions, and then we're going to stop our recording and have an open house per se. From Rami of Orlando, could instead head up to the state, we have the access of public revenue split into as many equal parts as there are people. Sort of like, for lack of a better term, universal basic income, I think is what he's trying to get at.
I would support I do support universal basic income, but only if it's paid for out of land rent. Right. I think if we start taxing people's incomes and taxing trade, it will be counterproductive. Yeah. It's a bit like Thomas Paine, isn't it? Yeah. He wanted every pensioner to be given, I think, £15 a year or something like that. Ed will know better than me. Mm-hmm. And he wanted every person starting off in life at a certain age, I don't know, perhaps it was 21, to be given a bounty to help them kick off in starting life. Rami said, he wanted it out of land rent.
Yeah, Rami concludes, in other words, at least in part, why not move the power of the purse from the state to the people directly? It's his comment.
Well, getting back to the subject of this presentation, Karl Marx, he envisaged a society where we walked into shops and we just took what we wanted because we'd only take what we need. and that we'd go to work and we'd work to our best endeavours. And that is what his expression that I put in the PowerPoint means. From each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. Marx saw society developing where there was no money, where there was no friction between classes, because there was only one class of people, the people that cared for each other. That's what he was aiming for. Marx wasn't aiming for totalitarian communist Bolshevik states. He was aiming for what I described in this thing as pure communism. And there would be no financial transactions between people. If you have no money and you have no financial transactions between people, then presumably you can have no exploitation. And that's what he was working to. Yeah, I think having a basic income is an important step in the right direction. And I'm a member of the Green Party here in the UK, and that is one of our policies.
So before we get Peter's and Michael's comment, I did want to have a word at the end. It has to do with ideas from Brian Hodgkinson, who's I would call him a Georgist, but he wrote a book in 2008 that I'm teaching currently with the Henry George, and it has a lot of parallels with what Dave has just been talking about.
Good. And when's your next
sorry,
class?
What's the book?
The model of the new economy, or the new
Oh,
model.
yeah, it goes into a lot of mathematical.
All
Yeah.
right.
Yeah, I've read it. Very good.
All right. And when's your next class, or when does your class meet?
It's every Wednesday, so we got one on the 29th, and then then two more in July.
Okay, and then you're going to do a big follow-up. Please tell me. Next question is from Peter Frank. I see Henry George's ideas as an appeal to the petit bourgeoisie, small business owners, and that is why his ideas have not caught on with the masses. Marx and socialists, on the other hand, understand that the world is divided into two groups, owners of income-producing property and non-owners. Lenin and the others understood that monopoly owners expanded their power to the globe. Hence, imperialism became the ultimate threat. And he wants to know your thoughts.
Oh, I welcome his thoughts. I'm finding it difficult. I'd like to see that. Can you put it on the screen? Is it possible to put it on the screen?
I can't really share.
Chat.
I can't share what I have the Q&A to you. You should be able to look it under the question and answer. I'll go back there. Let me see if I.
Oh, is it?
It's under the question and answer. Under the Q&A. Can you see that now?
What time under Q?
That is
Q&A or chat?
Yeah,
I'm on chat.
That's under Q&A, and it's at 3:21.
Yeah. So essentially, Peter was saying that
I haven't got it.
it appealed to a different group that weren't mobilized, I guess, was the point that I was making.
I think there's an important message for small businesses, and I've spoken to our UK Small Business Alliance, but I wouldn't, if I understood the question right or the comment right, I wouldn't say that small businesses have adopted Henry George. I wish they would. It is in their interests, and I just wish that they would adopt it. But and I similarly, most socialists don't see small businesses as any threat or any enemy. It's big business that they worry about. These businesses that pay their chief execs $5 million a year, those are, I think, the sort of businesses that socialists see as a threat.
Well, workers essentially abandoned him in 1887. I think that's Peter's point.
Michael has a comment. Is there anything to be said concerning the ownership of money? And if it is another example of a monopoly, is the money system the final monopoly under which all users pay rent?
I suppose the last point is true. We need money if we're going to collect the rent, unless we go back to collecting sheaves of wheat as people do their farming, but I don't know how that works in a city. You'd have to give us so many bricks. That would be self-crumbling. The problem, from my point of view, is that when we have, hopefully, when we have a socialist society, we will be collecting the rent of land. We will be encouraging small businesses. And I think we will have some large businesses, but they will probably be cooperatives. I'd like to see, even today, more people owning shares in companies. In 1975, I wrote a paper, which I've long lost, saying that even capitalist firms should have a third of their board should be workers, a third should be representing shareholder interest, and 1/3 should be independents, academics and others. But that was disowned by everybody. The capitalists didn't want it, and the trade unionists didn't want it. And interestingly, the trade unionists didn't want to be responsible for running the company. And yet I think it would have been a much better way of running a capitalist country.
Good. Is that the question we have?
Well, let me read a couple of Peter's more comments. He said most of the world lives on less than $2 a day, and we misunderstood one of his points. And he says, lastly, there is no mass appeal of Georgism to people who don't own anything, hence no ability to make George political. This is why Heilbronner called Henry George a utopian socialist. Which in a sense, I can see his point there.
I'm going on a trip to America, July the 13th. I'm flying to New York. I'll be in New York on July the 15th. And then we go on to Australia, and then we go to Canada. I would love to be going to Colombia right now. I think this new president needs the Henry George message. And I just wish somebody, perhaps our friend from Nicaragua, could go to Colombia and teach this new president about Henry George, and importantly his advisors, because you just know the way the story's going to go. He's very, well, I was going to say he's very popular. He's very popular with the poorer people at the present time, but when his reforms fail, he'll become unpopular, and they will fail if he doesn't tackle the land question in the Georgist way. So I think the people who've got nothing have got the most to win from Henry George. Our problem here in Britain is even you talk to a socialist who owns their own house and they're worried what's going to happen to the legacy they want to leave their child, rather than think what is best for the common good.
Mhm.